I really shouldn't be shocked at what I see on social media, and yet today I really was. There were Christians who were pushing back against the command to love your neighbor as yourself. And that seems so strange because that seems to be one of the clearest commandments. Now, the claim is that we do not love our neighbors as ourselves alone, meaning that there perhaps are some limits on who our neighbor really is. And the argument is that when Jesus summarizes the law as loving God and loving your neighbor, that it's not just loving your neighbor, you have to love God as well. And it seems to be that the assumption is by loving God, that gives us some wiggle room as to who we actually are commanded to love, that there may be some who we do not need to love. And there's all kinds of problems with this. First of all, yes, Jesus does connect loving God and loving your neighbor, but that's not really a way for us to get out of certain loving certain groups. Now, the argument that's been put forward is that a misuse of loving your neighbor has led to people being tolerant of sin, and that there are certain groups that are sinful, and therefore we should not be loving them. And yet, that's not really what we find in the Gospels. First of all, the command to love God is not a loosening of that, but actually a strengthening of our need to love our neighbors. And in terms of what that looks like, we can look to the example of Jesus and who did he love. And indeed, he loved the prostitutes and the tax collectors who were having sin in their life, and yet Jesus spent time with them and loved them and was actually criticized by the religious authorities for loving such people as that. And so that really pokes a huge hole in this argument that we should limit who we are supposed to love. Not only that, the parable of the Good Samaritan is actually a argument for the widest interpretation of who our neighbor is, because in that context, the Samaritan would have been the one who was least deserving of love, and yet Jesus points out that in this case, the Samaritan is the neighbor. And so that really suggests that we should be having a wide interpretation of loving our neighbor. And as well, when we look at the argument that it is to be limited by our love for God, and that commandment is linked to it, we also have to realize that Paul quotes love your neighbor twice, and James actually quotes it once in James 2:8. James says this: if you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. And neither in James nor in Paul is there a limiting of who the neighbor is, and nor is that made in connection with the love for God. Of course, Paul and James are both assuming that, but they are able to quote love your neighbor without the other passage, because it makes sense just to say love your neighbor. We can understand what that means. In 1 John, John makes it very clear that if we are to love the God that we cannot see, we need to do that by loving the people that we can see. So, is there a group that is not deserving of our love? Not according to the gospel. The gospel says we are to love all. There is no group, I don't care who they are, what they believe, how they act, there is no group that is excluded from the commandment for us to love our neighbor. Thank you for listening to what I've had to say, and please visit me at my website, stephenjbedard.com. Thank you, and God bless.